Remove covers from gears and remove output shaft assembly. Remove the bolts from the main cover. Pick up the cover using lifting equipment or by hand. Remove all the gears. Press the output shaft off the gear and clean all the surfaces. Inspect the bearings and the races for pitting, scoring, and other visible damage. To check the inner races, shine the light under the bearing, look inside, and check.
To remove a damaged outer bearing race, lay a bead of weld along the bearing race, and when it cools, it will shrink it enough to be able to pull the race out of the housing and then to replace it. Once the race is reinstalled, then you can put the input gear and the idler gear back into the housing. Place the cover back onto the housing and then reinstall all of the bolts and torque them down to spec. Use feeler gauges to measure the clearance between the main cover and gear cover to shim the bearings. Set feeler gauges until they experience slight resistance when being inserted and removed from the gap.
Use a micrometer to precisely measure the thickness of the shims being inserted. Place the shims between the main cover and the gear cover, being careful to assure that the bolt holes are aligned. Torque all the bolts for the gear cover down to spec. Repeat this process for the remaining idler gear. Use the press to reassemble the Dropbox output assembly. Once the assembly is reassembled, cautiously reinstall the output shaft assembly into the housing, being careful not to damage any components. Finally, reinstall the yoke onto the splines of the output shaft using the provided bolt. Torque all the bolts on the output shaft assembly down to spec.